morning, a few reflections on this St George's Patronal. As I've been thinking about St George, I've been thinking about the connections that we have in our lives. Those connections that perhaps feel more broken than usual at the moment, or more intense than usual. I wonder how you've been staying connected with people. Perhaps you've had more phone calls or been ringing people more. Perhaps you've learned to use new technology like I am. I hope that you're finding it helpful in connecting with others. Sometimes it's helpful just to see someone face to face, even if it is virtually. So today we think about connections, especially as we've gathered together but not gathered physically together. It's interesting, isn't it, how important St George's as a place can become for us. A place where we've gathered together to worship God over many years. I was listening to the radio and I found it very interesting that people were speaking about place and attachment to place in the same way that babies were attached to their mothers. Just as babies learnt security and love from that connection with their mother from early childhood, so too the psychologists were arguing that people found connections with place as securing. No wonder we feel a bit discombobulated at the moment. The ancient building of St George's connects us to the past. We know that for over 905 years now, people have been praying in that place, and it's been a presence in our community. Often wedding couples choose the place of St George's because it has a connection with their families. Families who've either been baptised or been married there themselves. Often people who are mourning like to go to St George's as a space where they find solace, spiritual solace in a physical place. We celebrate St George's as a focal point in our community throughout different generations into which people have poured their faith, their sorrow, their joy, their labour and their love. What's interesting also is that some people have commented to me on entering St George's or on being in St George's over a long period of time, that they can feel the prayers of the people of the past. When people come into church, what matters most is that it's a thin place. We mean by a thin place, a place where people can feel God, the presence of God with them. And that's done through prayers of our fellow saints in the past and ourselves as we worship together. The outer building provides a place of inner connection. I find it fascinating when people speak of inner connection, because often these days we find it in a mindfulness context or a psychological context. That understanding of inner connection and inner happiness, a positive connection with the self that fosters and nurtures our sense of self, our sense of worth. I find it interesting that modern psychology has picked up on something that Christianity has been talking about for such a long time. In many of our spiritual writings, from the Desert Fathers and Mothers through to Richard Rohr today, They all speak of that inner contentment found in prayer with God, that inner principle of thanksgiving, of being present, of forgiveness and peace. And yet as Christians we do not shy away from struggle either. St. George teaches us about struggle. As we consciously open our lives to God, as we consciously open our lives to the joy of God and to the acceptance of God, we have to name things in our own lives that are difficult to name, the things that we struggle with in our conscience, the decisions that we have to make to live our Christianity in our daily lives, the things that prevent us from coming close to God, our Maker, our Redeemer and our friend. We struggle with whatever is wrong in ourselves and in the world, armed with the peace and the joy of Jesus Christ. So we have connections with people, connections with buildings, our churches, and an inner connection with God and ourselves. But St. George, for me, as the map behind shows you, reminds me of global connections. For of the few facts that we do know about St. George is that he was born in Palestine, of a Palestinian mother and a Greek father, and his work was in the Roman army. He was a soldier, praised by the Emperor Diocletian. And when the Emperor decided that all Christians should actually be ordered to be arrested, St. George objected. He stood up for his faith and declared himself a Christian and was put to death. We think that the Emperor tortured George and put him to death on the 23rd of April, 303. St. George is venerated all over the world, from England to Georgia to Bulgaria, India, Syria and Iraq. And in many cities you will see churches and statues of St. George, in Genoa, Beirut, Rio de Janeiro, Barcelona and Moscow. He is highly respected by many Muslims, and in Jala in the Holy Land, where there's a Christian shrine to St. George, many Muslim people bring their loved ones to that place to be cured. St. George has connections all over the world, and we celebrate this global connection. We turn our eyes again to those places beyond England, those places which are perhaps out of the news because of our focus on COVID-19. We turn our faces to Syria and Libya, and to the immigrant peoples who are displaced. We turn our faces to those Christians who are being persecuted in parts of the world where it's difficult, more difficult than we can imagine, to stand up for their beliefs. And this brings me to my final reflection about disconnect. In the Gospel of John for today, Jesus talks about his followers being hated. He talks about his disciples being hated just as he was. The original audience of St. John's Gospel was very likely suffering very real and dangerous persecution. And so it's understandable that this conversation and prayer with Jesus is included just before Jesus is arrested. Jesus' command to his disciples has been to love. A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. And yet, with that command to love, there's no guarantee that his disciples would be loved in return. If Jesus was hated so bitterly, and he was such a loving person, his disciples cannot be expected to be treated differently. So on this St. George's Sunday, we're rightly proud of our martyrs and saints, and are challenged within ourselves when we meet the language of hatred for others or hatred for ourselves. This disconnect, which is named in the Gospel, encourages each of us to reflect on what it means to struggle for Jesus Christ, whoever we are and wherever we are.